Good morning, everyone, and welcome to I believe, our fifth week of Crop Diagnostic School sessions. Today, again, you have your lovely set of CDS panelists available to answer your questions. We have Ann Kirk on the line, our cereal specialist. We have Dennis Lang, who is our pulse specialist. We have John Gablowski, our provincial entomologist. We have Kim Brown, our weeds specialist, on the line this morning as well. And that seems to be who we've got so far. I know John Hurd's not able to join us this week because he is away fishing somewhere. And David Kaminsky is feeling under the weather, so he's not going to be here today either. So this is your group. We're a bit of a smaller group, but that is okay. We have lots of energy and ability to answer all of the questions that you guys bring in today. So about questions, again, if you go to your chat box or question box, you are able to type in a message or a question to your panelists. So if you can't see your chat box, I'm just typing good morning into it, so it will come up and you will see where that chat is on your screen. So either the chat or the question box is a great way to do this. So while people are thinking about their questions, posting their questions into the chat or question box, I have a question first for John Gablowski. This is not necessarily a question that came in from anyone special. It's actually a question that I have for him. And that's because yesterday I had gone into my garden to check on the status of my green beans, and I got swarmed by mosquitoes. And I am trying to figure out, we have not had very much rain where I live, and I don't exactly know where all of these mosquitoes have come from. And later on, I was talking to an agronomist who I mentioned this to, and he said, it's awful when you walk fields right now and you can't find water anywhere. So John G., what the heck is going on with all of these mosquitoes?
Okay, so a little bit of basic mosquito life cycle biology here. Mosquitoes need water. And normally when you get heavier rainfall, you don't really see the mosquitoes for anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks after that rainfall, because they need the rain to stimulate the eggs that are there to hatch. Once those eggs hatch, it's going to be 1 to 2 weeks before you start seeing adult mosquitoes. And mosquito populations from a single rain event usually go almost bell curve style, where you get your heavy rain, mosquitoes will, like I said, start hatching out a week to 2 weeks later, build, peak, and then it takes a week to 2 weeks for that population to crash. So you're probably somewhere around that peak right now. So if you think back, probably about 2 weeks ago, 1 to 2 weeks ago, there probably was a heavy enough rain event to leave some standing water. Now, as far as the amount of water you need, I'm just going to give you an example here. We were doing a scout camp one time, and there was a lot of mosquitoes. This was near the floodway in Winnipeg, and we were trying to figure out where the mosquitoes were coming from. So we did a bit of an experiment. We had some of our Cub Scouts go and take their mosquito dippers and go check in the floodway. They got next to nothing. Somebody had driven a quad through the field going to the floodway, left some ruts in the soil, some fairly, I'll say, maybe 6 to 8 inch deep ruts in that field that filled up with water. When we checked those for mosquitoes, every dip we took, we could get dozens, sometimes up to almost close to 100 mosquitoes. Those quad tracks were breeding literally thousands of mosquitoes. So they're not necessarily coming from the rivers and streams in your area. That's all it takes is some ruts in a field left by a tractor or a quad to hold enough standing water for, say, 7 to 10 days to breed a lot of mosquitoes. And they really like that shallow, murky water that you would get in something like a quad or a tractor rut. So if you've got some of those areas that could hold water for a while and you had a heavy rain, say, a couple of weeks ago, that's probably where they're coming from. And give it another week and those populations should crash, providing we don't get another heavy rain event.
And that's what I was hoping to hear, except for the fact that we actually need the rain. So it's one of those things that dry conditions, the one blessing that comes from dry conditions is less mosquitoes, but right now Man, I feel like I haven't seen a mosquito in a few years, and all of a sudden I saw all of them at once. While you are on with us still, John G, still sticking to entomology, grasshoppers. So I know people are starting to see grasshoppers. They're starting to spray for grasshoppers. And while we were getting ready for the call this morning, Anne mentioned that on the radio she heard that the arm of St. Laurent, right, Anne?
Yes.
They called a state of emergency or a state of agricultural emergency because of dry conditions and because the grasshopper population is so bad. So we've heard of people spraying for grasshoppers right now. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, right now is the appropriate time to be doing grasshopper control. Generally, we're trying to target the grasshoppers when the hatch is done, but before we have too many adults in the population, which is right now. Hatch is wrapped up. Usually grasshopper hatch happens over June, and by late June, we're usually done. This year, we were probably a little bit ahead of normal. So this is a good time to be controlling grasshoppers. The roadside ditches, field edges, anywhere that had lush green vegetation late last August and September, those are probably the areas where most of the hatch would have occurred. So check those areas, and if the grasshopper populations are thick, those are the areas you need to be targeting. This year, we're seeing a species called clearwing grasshoppers that in many areas seems to be dominant, and it's one that we haven't seen in a while in big numbers. And what's different about it, it likes grassy plants. It rarely feeds on broadleaf plants. It's not that it won't, but it really prefers grassy plants. So it may stick to the roadside ditches a bit more if it's next to canola or soybeans or something. But if it defoliates the ditches enough, it will start looking for other hosts. Watch your cereal crops carefully. Watch your forage grasses, your pastures. I had a call from somebody yesterday saying they had a canola field where they had moved in to the edge of the canola field, but they weren't touching the canola. But there was a lot of grasshoppers. They were wondering what's going on here. They sent me some photos. They were clearing grasshoppers. I doubt they'll touch that canola, but if there's any cereals nearby, I'd watch those really carefully.
Okay, and that's a good point too around making sure that you know what you're scouting for, like you know what you're trying to identify, and what you need to identify when you're scouting to see what's going to actually be a kind of a damaging insect in a case like this. Another question coming in about, oh, Anne, I'm gonna flip this to you. Temperatures, hot and dry. Again, we're talking about dry, theme of the year. Hot and temperatures. How have these hot and dry temperatures affected cereal crops so far this year?
Sure. So cereal crops, last week and the weekend was definitely the hottest conditions we've seen so far. So very hot, very dry conditions. And a lot of the cereal crops would have been just finishing anthesis or in anthesis. So obviously not the best time to see all those hot, dry conditions. So generally during that, flowering stage and pollination, that's where we see the crop water needs, be quite high. Since when we did see those crops flowering during the very hot and dry weather, we would expect to see a reduction in the number of seeds per spike because of either pollination failure or kernel abortion shortly after fertilization. So we do see this just with high temperatures, and this would be particularly devastating if coupled with moisture stress. So we, have seen a lot of moisture stress in many areas as well. So plants do continue to have a high water requirement during early grain fill as well. So in some cases, you may see, bleached spikelets or dead tillers that, ran out of water and weren't able to fertilize, and you'd see that probably in a few weeks. So yeah, definitely a stressful time for cereal crops and any crops that are flowering, like canola and flax as well, to have such high temperatures and dry conditions. And then also during grain filling, if we do continue to have high temperatures, I see the upcoming weekend is supposed to be hot as well, not quite as hot, but it can reduce the rate of photosynthesis, especially if it's dry and the plants are trying to conserve moisture, which can reduce the amount of starch available. So that can, can result in lighter kernels as well. And I also just wanted to mention, sorry, that I did have seen some reseeded cereal crops that are a bit behind, that might not have been flowering, and those high temperatures in an earlier crop could result in some of those tillers being let go by the plant, and maybe less spikelets per spike or less spikes per plant.
Yeah, that's a good point too. So switching gears to a different crop, and actually I'm going to bring this question to you, Kim. So talking about sunflowers, so I've got sunflowers, they're getting to be about 2 feet tall, but there's quite a few weeds that are germinating, and some are larger that escaped my first herbicide pass. Can I go in again to try to control them?
It depends. Good government answer, right? It depends. So it depends what kind of sunflowers you have, what you've already sprayed. I'm a really big fan of pre-seed and pre-emerge on sunflower because our options in crop are pretty limited. So this time of year, now I don't know, when you say about 2 feet tall, I don't know how many leaves are there. So it would be nice to know the leaf stages. So depends what they are. If it's a clearfield canola and you've already sprayed your in crop, you can only spray that once. You really can't come back with another innie. You can't be stacking your group 2s like that. The same thing if it's an express sunflower, you've already sprayed, you're allowed like 1 spray a year kind of thing. But if it's something like, if it's grass weeds, we actually do have a couple of products that you can come in. There's no staging restriction for something like an Assure, which is quizalofop. That's a group 1 grass herbicide. Also Post, good old Post, which is Tithoxidum. There's also Centurion, which is Clethodim. Now the problem with these, there is no staging restriction on these. So you can come in and get your grassy weeds out at any stage. You really just are spraying for the stage of the weeds, and there's no staging restriction on the sunflowers, but you really have to watch the pre-harvest interval. Something like Assure has a 60-day pre-harvest interval. That's not a problem. Something like Centurion or Select, which is Clethodim, has a 72-day PHI. And for some reason, Post has a 105-day PHI. So I'm not sure if Dane is on the call, and I was going to ask him, where would you consider the end harvest on a sunflower? Because they're such a long season crop, but probably that killing frost that we get. I know that they're in the field usually quite late in the year, but that killing frost is probably when you have to kind of count backwards from. And realistically, our long-term averages for killing frost are mid-September. So you would have to be careful with some products because of the pre-harvest interval. They are very safe. Again, these group 1 products, you'll take your grass weeds out. They're great. If you're looking at broadleaf weeds, you really don't have a lot of options. If you haven't used muster, you can, but it's only up to the 8-leaf stage. And again, if you haven't used all of the innies that if it's a clearfield tolerant sunflower and you hadn't maybe done some of your sprays yet, if you still you could still do a solo spray or something. I'm not sure. It's just going to depend what you've sprayed already, but you do have to watch those. Those ones are limited to your 8-leaf stage in sunflowers. So you really do not have a lot of options. You are far better off to have had some residual weed control in there and take the pressure off those in-crop sprays, because the in-crop sprays in sunflowers are extremely limited.
Perfect, thanks, Kim. And while we're on the question, or the topic, I guess, of sunflowers, Dane, questions come in about verticilium wilt. So I've got a sunflower field with verticilium wilt. Is there anything that can be done now, or are resistant varieties the only way or option to handle this issue?
Resistant varieties are going to be your number 1 management strategy. They're coupled with a rotation. Verticilium typically affects crops more severely on certain pieces of land, certain fields where it's known to have some sort of residual and hang around on stubble. This early in the year, verticilium infection can be pretty devastating, to be honest, especially once it gets into the stalk and starts wilting off the plant more at the base versus higher up in the canopy. You can lead to low yields, lighter test weight, those sorts of things. resistant varieties, like I said, yes, are your best strategy. There have been some fungicides that do have activity labeled for verticillium dahliae, the causal agent of verticillium in sunflowers. Those fungicides, Vertisan from DuPont, I guess it would be Corteva now, was one of the few products that was labeled or for suppression of verticillium. I don't know how effective it was because that product didn't stay on the market terribly long, and I think it has since been pulled. There may still be some supply in chem sheds sitting around, but I don't believe it's manufactured anymore.
Okay, thank you, Dane. Moving back to, let's move to corn. Anne, I've been noticing leaf rolling in corn. How is this going to affect my corn yield?
Yeah, definitely last week did notice, and still continuing yesterday, did notice quite a bit of leaf rolling in corn. So that's, the plant's defensive method to reduce water loss. So when you do see leaf rolling, it's in response to insufficient plant moisture content and high temperatures. So the plant's just trying to protect itself from moisture loss by rolling its leaves to, reduce the exposed surface area. So, you don't always see yield loss with leaf rolling, but, pre-tasseling and pre-silking, you would see less yield loss than if you see leaf rolling, during that really high water use period, which would be, at tassel emergence. So, what I've seen for in terms of yield estimates, that if you have leaf rolling the entire day, so say 12 hours, then you would expect to see some yield reduction. And the rule of thumb that I've read is that you could see about 1% yield loss for every 12 hours of leaf rolling. But if during silking, you would see more yield loss with leaf rolling. So if you see leaf rolling for a portion of the day, so just the hottest part of the day or the afternoon, at this point, you wouldn't expect to see, you wouldn't expect that to translate into yield loss, but you should be concerned if there's leaf rolling for, the entire daytime period in your corn. And, that's also so a little bit of leaf rolling, say in the afternoon, the plant is obviously stressed, but you wouldn't call it severe stress. But if you do see leaf rolling the entire daytime period, then you would expect that your plant's in severe stress.
Okay, and keeping on the cereals theme, Anne, and I would say this feels like a question we've covered a lot, but we're covering it a lot for a good reason. So we're finding a lot of leaf disease in cereal canopies showing up after heading or anthesis. Is there any point to trying to spray a fungicide to control this? Farmers seem to want to revenge spray everything this year.
Yeah, I don't think that, that's a good question. I don't think there'd be a point in spraying it. People are not spraying for leaf diseases, generally wouldn't be spraying for leaf diseases at this time. I guess it really depends on what your yield potential is in your crop. And, if people, it does seem risky in this year when it is quite dry. So I think a lot of people wouldn't be spraying FHB fungicides, say on their wheat and barley, just due to the dry conditions, but that obviously is very regional dependent. Yeah, I probably wouldn't recommend it, but yeah, we are seeing some leaf diseases post heading. I don't think you'd end up with a big yield benefit from that though.
Okay, and still, again, sticking to a fungicide theme, except this is kind of for you, John G. So I'm planning on doing a fungicide application for sclerotinia canola. Adding in an insecticide would be cheap, although no insects have been detected at threshold levels. Considering that we have sprayers going already, it's just a few extra dollars an acre, does this make sense for insurance, essentially, for insects like lygus bugs, diamondback moth, Bertha armyworm, things like armyworm, I can't speak this morning, things like that, or is it not worth my effort?
Okay, yeah, there's a few things you have to consider. Now, intuitively, you might be doing the math and thinking, if it's just a few dollars an acre more, it's good insurance. We're spraying anyway. What's the harm? The one thing you do have to consider, though, is in canola, even though to some degree there's self-pollination, the research has shown you do get a yield boost by having pollinators in canola, and that yield boost is often in the 10 to 20% range. So if anything you do that disrupts pollination can remove that extra 10 to 20% that the pollinators are giving you. And there's a study going on right now in Alberta where they're, again, retesting this yield bump from pollinators in canola. And they had the foresight to test this under different soil moisture conditions, both in greenhouse, and they're doing some outdoor studies. With their greenhouse studies, their yield boost under dry conditions from pollinators was 20%. So that's quite significant. So that's something to consider. By tank mixing in an insurance insecticide just in case, you could inadvertently be decreasing your yield, especially in a dry year like this. So if you start doing the math, unless you've got an insect that is at economic threshold, odds are you're not only are you spending the few bucks an acre on the insecticide, but you could inadvertently be decreasing your yield as well, which is another economic hit. So that's why we really encourage people, scalp the canola. Don't just put in an insecticide at flowering just in case. That's a period of time when you really have to think carefully about your insecticide decisions. If by chance you do reach a threshold during flowering, do whatever you can to increase that yield bump from the pollinators. So if you can, wait till flowering is done. If you can't wait till flowering is done and you have to spray during flowering, do it as late in the day as you can, and try, if you have the option of using something selective, that might pay for itself as well.
Those are good options too. Like really having to weigh those costs and benefits to the act of spraying, and not just blanket spraying and assuming you're doing the right thing, because again, those pollinators we know are so important. Speaking of things that could be potentially maybe an economic loss, Dennis Lang, rolling. How late can I roll my soybeans? I rolled at 4th trifoliate on Canada Day.
Yes. So an interesting question, because now most of us wouldn't be considering rolling by this stage already. We're pretty much past the stage. And, but your pulse specialist decided to do a little experiment the other day. I have an old railroad track that goes through my soybean field, and of course, you know, one day last week I started walking to pick up stones, and it took me about 45 minutes to do one little area, and I'm like, okay, fine, I'll just come back another day. Later that morning, I was on the way to Winnipeg, and noticed there was a small 25-foot roller at my local equipment dealer. So I thought, hey, it's supposed to be hot tomorrow. Let's go and try roll my soybeans on Canada Day. So I did that. They're about 5th trifoliate, and there was the odd flower showing up. And Canada Day, as you know, was very hot. I went out at about 5:30 in the afternoon. Rolled a pass, looked behind me when I got to the end, and I'm like, oh, they're still almost standing back up already. Now, I wouldn't normally recommend that, and I guess the reason I kind of brought this forward, this question forward, was because there have been some growers that have been rolling in the last 2 weeks that have had some real issues with damage to the plants after they roll. The problem there has been they've gone out at that 27 degrees that we always talk about, but the plants are a lot bigger. And from what we're seeing is, if you're going with that, you know, ideally 1st, 2nd trifoliate are when you want to be rolling, but if you're in that 3rd, 4th trifoliate stage, you want to be over 30 degrees. You know, the warmer it is, the better they bounce back. I went out to that field yesterday and I can't even tell where I rolled. So, and that was at a 35-degree day. So if you end up running into those instances where you absolutely have to roll, and in this case, because of the zone, that's the only reason it was only about 5 acres, so it wasn't a whole field or anything. But it was really quite interesting to note that 27 degrees, like a day we have this morning at 21, I wouldn't even think about going and doing that because you do way too much damage. So something to keep in mind for the future, that as those plants get bigger, you know, roll on a warmer day. Like, don't use a 27, use that more 30 as a starting point for rolling. So that's kind of the points I wanted to make on that one.
So what you're saying is we may have got lucky having the heat when we did for rolling soybeans this past weekend.
Yeah.
And for anyone who is panicking when I asked the question, going, who on earth would have gone out rolling at this point? Trust that it was an experiment from your local pulse specialist.
And I have pictures to prove it too, so.
Well, I look forward to seeing those pictures because that'll be, and that's always a question we often get in the soil management world too, is especially earlier in the spring like we had this year, is, you know, when could we be going out rolling without causing more damage to the soil surface and having more of that wind erosion early when we had those dry and windy conditions earlier in the spring. Again, talking heat and dry conditions, but mostly in this case heat, Dane. How is this past week of heat affecting my canola, the pod production and such? Is this going to be causing losses? At what temperature are we really starting to see those losses occur?
Right. It's been a rough week for canola and many other crops. Canola starts seeing heat blast and pod abortion around that 28 to 29 degrees Celsius mark. I think the academic research says 29.5 if you want to get down to details. At that point during the daytime high, above that daytime high, we'll start seeing pollen, not that it becomes sterile or becomes infertile, but that the pollen dries out, especially under days when we have low relative humidity. The pollen dries out. And when it dries out, it isn't able to grow and germinate that pollen tube that grows into the flower and then pollinates and sets seed for that flower. That is part of it. The stress of high temperatures can also cause hormonal imbalances in the plant. That throws off the cytokinin levels relative to other hormones, and that starts causing flower abortion, or causes the petals not to open or form completely. It also causes the stamens in the flowers not to elongate quite as well as they could, meaning the pollinators couldn't get in as easily, the wind can't get in as easily and move that pollen around and pollinate that plant. Normally, we expect to see some reprieve from hot daytime temperatures when we get a cooler overnight and we get some dew and something like that to cool off the plant, that evapotranspiration effect. But when we don't have temperatures at night dip below 16 degrees Celsius, it's the same thing. That plant doesn't get that same level of recuperation. So above 28, 29 degrees during the day and 16 degrees overnight, we do see yield losses. Quantifiably, those losses aren't truly set, because if we have some relatively decent growing conditions, or we do luck out and get some moisture, canola always does produce more flowers than it is capable of setting pods. So that plant, give it a week or two and hopefully things go back more or less to normal and recovers from that stress. That canola raceme will extend a little longer. The flowers and the buds on the higher part of those stems or on the side branches should be able to flower in a little bit more optimal conditions, and we shouldn't get that heat blast effect on those. So canola does have the ability to compensate to some degree. So yield losses from heat blast might not be as severe as expected, but canola is always expected to lose some flowers and not always set pods on every point.
Awesome, thanks, Dane. Okay, so that really brings us to our full kind of half hour here. Just had a comment pop up. Said, you know, thanks for that explanation, Dane. Hope for some rain later next week or later this week. And I think we have definitely have hope for some rain around these parts. Actually, Kim, yeah, you have something you wanted to ask, I think. Go ahead. You may be muted, Kim.
So sorry about that. Dane, I've seen some fields up in the Pembina Hills that are on really light land. They're done flowering, especially on the tops of the hills and stuff. If we get some good weather, will you, like, can we see some side branching start to come a little bit later? Or what do you think? Are some of these areas in the fields, like, they're done, they're fully potted, the flowers are gone, you know, they're done. So, like, what's the chance that if we do get decent weather, do you see that coming back and having a bit more growth, or what do you think happens in these situations?
Unfortunately not. Once the flowering process is complete, that leads to a reproductive shift in canola plants. It's not going to be focusing its energy now on producing more stems to flower out, but it will move into reproductive mode. Now that it's been pollinated, whatever seed was there on those dry knolls, the plant is going to focus on filling them. Unless we had a wicked wind that took off the tops of the plants or hailed out the tops that caused that apical dominance to be reversed or reverted, then we may see some lateral branching from the sides of that stem. But otherwise, once the flowering process is complete, that is what it is.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. All right, thank you guys. Thank you to our panelists again for all of your time and insightful questions and answers, I should say, this morning. Thank you again to our participants for asking all of your questions today as well. And so with that, I would like to point out that tomorrow is Crop Talk at 9 a.m. So for anyone who is registered for Crop Talk, I believe Lionel is planning a report this week generally for just where the crop is at. So if anybody else is looking at kind of hearing that and seeing where things are at in terms of crop status, that's going to be tomorrow's Crop Talk panel. And when we send out the link to the recording for this, I'm also going to have Lori add in the contact information for all of us on the panel here, so that when you have questions, feel free to reach out to us and we can help you with those answers. So as always, have a great day, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.